I recently had the chance to interview one of my favorite YouTubers, Zach Heyde. Zach's channel is a goldmine for young and aspiring film composers with a range of videos covering everything from composing music to audio technology and professional development. This was my first interview that I have ever conducted, so at the beginning I was super nervous. But Zach turned out to be a really cool guy, and I ended up having a blast just chatting with him about storytelling and film music. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. So I know you're a busy man, so let's kind of dive right in, shall we?
Cool, let's do it.
All right, awesome. So I kind of sent these questions ahead of time, but we're kind of just going to talk about the storytelling aspects of scoring and working on films, right? So this first question we got is just what kind of role does a film composer play in actually telling the story of a film?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I see it, you could have music follow along and do everything that a good story does. It could hit every beat, when the character's sad, they could be sad. When there's excitement, there could be excitement. And sometimes that is the case. But in my experience, some of the coolest or most interesting or most impactful music tends to be the music that is saying something about the picture or media that is not happening on screen. And that's where scoring gets really subtle. I think in the beginning, a lot of people tend to start on the surface level and we'll look and we'll say, oh, he's angry. What's angry music sound like? But it's just not going to contribute the same amount of value as if you're seeing a character and you're saying, is he angry? He's acting angry, or is he hurt? Or is he sad? Or does he feel betrayed? And capturing those kinds of emotions musically can give the audience an eye or an ear into that character's psyche. And in that way, we get to feel what the character's feeling instead of just seeing what everybody else is seeing.
Exactly. It's the beautiful thing about like a score is it can kind of reveal things that are happening underneath the scene. Underneath the action. And it's almost like it helps you go a little bit deeper into the characters and the world. I almost think of it like the film composer is the first Redditor to get access to the movie. All right, because we're the first ones that really dive deep into it and get to put our opinion on what's happening. I mean, if you're working with the director, that's amazing, and you get that chance to kind of talk about the story and what they want you to perform. But a lot of people on YouTube, myself included at times, we've all got experiences working on projects where we didn't get to work with a director. Right now I'm partnering with the Indie Film Music Contest to put together a class on film scoring. And none of the competitors are going to be able to have access to the directors of those films.
Right.
And so in a way, that's kind of scary because it's up to you to come up with what you see deeper in the story. But in another way, that just really frees you up to just dive more deeply and go, all right, what are these characters experiencing? What do I see in this? What are the connections I make on a deeper level? And you kind of get to overanalyze at times, which is why in my process, the first thing I always just summarize the story with one sentence. So that I can always return to that, because I have made the mistake so many times of just getting in my own head, over analyzing a scene, getting super excited about this piece of music I'm writing, and then you put it up against the scene and suddenly, kind of missed the mark there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I used to kind of work a lot before I would get picture. I would work with sometimes scripts, or I'd want to get things as early as possible. And I think sometimes people get trained that way. They say, the earlier you can get on the project, get on it. I think there is some merit to that, in that you can avoid things like temp music if you're on a project really early. You can sort of, maybe a director's going to cut to some early music you have, but on the flip end, they might cut to some early music you have, and then if you decide to make changes, they fall in love with what you've originally written and it's unchangeable. Or you've, like you pointed out, you've overinvested in ideas or imagery that are really just like conjurings of your own imagination as opposed to the vision of the project. So for me, I almost always do, I'd say I do probably 100% of my thinking in sync with the picture, or at least with the picture in front of me. And I'm also just a very reactive person to music. I need to hear it to know whether or not it's going to work, and I need to hear it to picture to know if it's going to work. So not everybody's like that. Some people love to run away and sketch, and I'm not like that. I need to be I write a flute part and then be like, is this flute part working to picture or not? I very like step by step like that.
Oh, right. Like I also take a really step-by-step process. And I because of my experience, I've actually got more experience scoring plays than films. Professionally. So I've done competitions, I've done films like that, but most of my professional experience is scoring to something that I don't get to watch.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you find that freeing, or do you find that, have you done to picture and found that more challenging, or what's that been like for you?
It's freeing until the actors get involved. And then you're like, oh, their delivery completely changes. Now my music doesn't, because I'm not a trained actor. So I love stories. I love reading. And so I figure I have this voice for the characters in my head as I'm writing the soundtrack. And of course, the most infuriating thing with a play is trying to get the timings down. Because I can work with kind of Zoom. There are a couple of Zoom meetings where I got to watch a rehearsal. But in the rehearsal, the director is stopping, they're pausing, they're changing things. And it's so difficult in a live performance to kind of lock things in place on film. And so I find that I have to find different ways to write adjustable kind of music, things that they don't necessarily hit specific points, but they sound like they are. Yeah. And if there are moments in the music where the director's like, really, I want this here. I want this here. I want this huge part with the horns to really land at this moment. I need to figure out a way to cue the actor into when that moment is. And so one of the strategies I like to use is I'll add some kind of rhythmic element, whether it's like staccato strings or something that hits every other beat, or something that's subtle but countable. So the actor can go, oh, that was a simple swell. I've got like 10 drum beats or whatever until that big thing. That helps gauge their timing.
I think there's very similar challenges too, even in film, even though it's pre-made, in the sense that as the viewer of the film, but also the composer, you sort of have an idea of where things are going long before the audience does. And as you go through the scoring process, you start to forget sort of what the audience is or isn't aware of in terms of like whether something's happening. And so some composers will fall into the trap of either kind of like showing their hand a little too early. Or too late. Yeah, right, exactly. Or the other issue I see really commonly is people get a really cool musical piece going, and they love the piece of music that they're writing, and they gradually start to derail from what's happening on screen. So you'll see like, it's really in sync, really like grooving with the picture, and then they're kind of like, I got a new idea musically that I want to run with, and they run with it, and then you feel that disjointed moment when the picture ends and the music didn't want to stop. And it's a very, very common thing I see from both ends of that spectrum. So the most challenging thing for sure is about syncing your story arc in the music with the story arc of the picture, which is very challenging to do, because depending on how you write, you might have to structure it, like kind of figure it out all in advance. Or if you're like me, you kind of go on the fly and have to course correct often and early. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the trickier parts, because I try to take a very much like pro story approach when I'm writing my music. So I spend a lot of time studying the story. And I think a lot of that influence comes from, I read a book on Howard Shore a long time ago when I was first getting started. And they mentioned, oh yeah, he spent 6 months studying the story before he started writing music.
Wow.
And so at a young age, I was like, aha, so that's what a composer's got to do. I got to spend time studying.
Yeah.
And I don't spend 6 months. But I always kind of take this approach where I study the story and I start writing music outside of the film. And so
I think it's a very romantic way of composing.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? And it's just what works well for me. And I'll write the theme and I'll think, this is amazing, this is awesome. Then I'll find out, okay, now how do I make this fit this particular scene? The scene is either too short or it's too long.
Sure.
And especially working with plays and stuff, I had a moment with the director. Because especially working with a play, the directors for plays aren't often trained to think musically like a director for a film might be, which is something because there's always
yeah,
the issue with directors not thinking of the music. But like moments where I have had a moment where like one time the director's like, "Oh, this is awesome." I was like, "We just need to be shorter." I did the math. Could you just increase the tempo by 25 BPM? I'm like,
oh,
I was
yeah,
like,
yeah.
Okay, that I was like,
25 is quite a bit.
can I? Yes, but it's gonna change it from kind of like this smooth jazz kind of theme into something. I was like, and I had to kind of go through. Okay, so what is she trying to do? It's like she wants an increase in energy. All right, so if I don't change, like, how can I do that without increasing the tempo?
You're often translator for your creative peers. Yeah, that's very often the case. It's you can't take the people communicate things differently, and you're often playing psychologist as to saying like, what is it that they actually need, or is it because they feel insecure about something, some aspect of their picture or their media, and what can I do to sort of be the person that helps with that, or convinces them that it doesn't need it, or whatever it be, so
right,
yeah,
well,
yeah, 100%.
It's an adventure. It really is.
Yeah.
It is different from concert music because you've got someone else's story that you're trying to match, like you said, to the narrative of the music, which is actually an awesome segue into question number 2.
Cool.
Which is, what elements do you think a soundtrack needs in order to be successful at telling the story?
Yeah, I remember you sent this one to me and I was like, oh, shoot. Because that's a good question.
Right?
I think that there are a lot of aspects that make really iconic film or media music that we've heard. I mean, there's obviously stylistic stuff that can really play into it. But there's also so many examples when things aren't the same, because I would say, oh, you need a great melody, but I can think of plenty of fantastic scores that don't have great melodies. Honestly, I think the most important thing is about having a unique perspective into the story as the composer. I think Zimmer actually talks about that, and he's got a really good mindset on that, which is like, you don't have to have the most original music, but you have to have an original perspective. And so looking at an animation about a gnome making carpentry, you could treat that at face value as what it is and make it like, a goofy piece about a gnome and not take it seriously and be like, oh, it's a cartoon. Or you could kind of be like, maybe he's lonely. Maybe he's old and weathered and he, lived a long life with his other gnomes doing, work he didn't love, and now he's finally doing work he loves. And whatever it is, like, you're going to bring a perspective about that story that's going to influence the way you write the music that I think is actually more important than any single musical aspect. And I think that's a big thing that a lot of composers that I work with don't think about, because we're kind of all taught and nerd out on the musical things. Like, oh, I want to learn some cool modes. Tell me how to write action music. Tell me how to use percussion. Tell me what makes a great melody. And those things are useful as tools, but they have to be tools used for a great idea or a great perspective. And so that, as the starting point, I think is a really, really good way to look at things. And usually it's just like any part of creativity. It's about relating. It's going to be a reflection of your own thought process about life. That's, you're going to have your own perspective and take on what stories mean and represent. Yeah. And that will probably come through in your music, whether you intend it or not.
I really like that. I'm a composer. I don't think there's a composer under the sun who hasn't like binge watched Hans Zimmer clips on YouTube.
Right.
I've never heard of that. I've heard him talk about story, but I've never heard that kind of unique perspective. And it makes so much sense. Like,
it's what makes us all, unique as composers in the first place. It's just something that's not. It's easy to dissect people's styles by the musical aspects. Yes. Oh, Thomas Newman uses Lydian, or Howard Shore likes to use low woodwind voicings. But that's not really, you're talking about the result of a mindset or philosophy on creation.
Yeah, and just the exposure of what kind of music they loved listening to.
Yeah.
What kind of music they love playing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It all kind of merges together to create someone's style. And I've said that a couple times to different students, but there's all this talk about how it's important to develop your own style, and that gets people a little kind of panicky about how do I find my unique, authentic voice or whatever. And really all it comes down to is what's your default setting? All right. What do you default to? That's your style. And the more music you listen to, the more things you try out, the more your kind of default setting can reset. It's your factory settings kind of thing.
Don't you find it's a bit more about like giving yourself permission to be your default as opposed to like having to reinvent the wheel? Yeah.
Right. I mean, when I first started, I love the sound of seventh chords. All right. And so my default, anytime I'm at the keyboard, I default to a seventh chord instead of a triad. It's just the way I am. And so sometimes there are moments I was like, I can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again.
Can I? Right.
I really actually enjoy this sound. And so that's what I always default to it. I allow myself when I'm trying to plan out my harmony. And so sometimes it helps to, like write things down and visualize them. So if I'm stuck and I need to figure out what chords I have available to me, which directions I can go, I'll always write out the seventh chords and not the triads, because that's where I feel at home.
To be honest with you, I think it's very parallel with just how people approach life or career goals in general. Like I notice, I mean, I'm right there with everybody else. I bashed myself over the head trying to figure out my voice forever. And I mean, I was particularly like driven insane when I remember I had like pitched my music to someone. I like met them at a bar and they had heard my reel. They were composer themselves, and they basically were like, hey, everything you got on your reel, it's like pretty generic, essentially, was what they kind of were insinuating. They were a little bit nicer about it, but that was pretty much what they said. But then they were like, oh, but that, weird sound design you did about that tea kettle, now that was cool. And I was so disappointed because that was like the thing I did, like that was like the avant-garde experimental thing that I was like not... Yeah, it didn't like speak to my heart, it spoke to my brain. So I was like really shattered by that and just like, oh my God, I got to find my voice and blah, 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 blah. And the short of it is really like you pointed out, it's just when I started making decisions about my music that were based on my own rules and not based on anyone else's rules, like Thomas Newman wouldn't do that. John Powell wouldn't use this chord. Howard Shore wouldn't use this woodwind choice or whatever it was. Once I started to recognize that those rules were actually rules from other people's constructs, that's what enabled me to just write freely. And then writing freely is what enabled like a voice to come out. And I think it's almost completely parallel with career stuff too, because I'm a YouTube composer, which is a very odd, off the beaten path kind of thing.
Yeah.
At least for commercial composers. And I went through the exact same process. Same thing. It's just like, that's what I liked doing, but am I allowed to do that? Can I do that? And eventually just start to say, you know what? Yeah, whatever makes you happy and whatever you are good at and can embrace. Right. So.
And that's well said. Let's say the next follow-up question to that, though, I'd say, because you got a lot of good kind of perspective on creating your, like, not creating, but kind of discovering your own unique voice and using that unique perspective to tell the story. And question is, like, how do you figure out that unique perspective? So you're watching the film the first time. I mean, at least for me, I almost never start a film thinking, oh, I've got a great idea. I know how I'm going to do this. I always got that little sense of panic, like, oh.
Yeah, if you do, tell me the secret. If you figure it out.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, first and foremost, what the creative person you're working with, what their vision is, rules. This is my perspective. I think there are some people who are less pragmatic than I am and less practical, who are way more artsy, that would totally disagree and say the director doesn't know what they're talking about and I'm going to show them what they need. And all power to you. That's not how I am. I listen a lot and pay a lot of attention to what people are saying in the beginning, because they've been with their project for far longer than I have. And for me to have an ego about what I think their brainchild needs and they don't know, is, for me, that's not the way to work. So I start from poring over whatever they've provided to me, if anything, and what their vision is. I use that as kind of my anchor. Then from that point, when I'm watching a picture, I'm paying really close attention to my first watch through, because that's the only time you're going to see it once, like for the first time. You only have one opportunity to see it fresh. And from that point forward, you're always making decisions about, as a constructor of ideas, which is then going to influence how you approach picture. So that first watch is incredibly important. And what I'll do is I'll pay attention to just the moments that really spark strong emotions in me, and kind of anchor around those and say, okay, I was kind of watching. And that moment was like an aha. And I'll try to get some adjectives for that. And just kind of like make a note of maybe how many those were. If this is like a full length film, I would not do this I would just watch the film the first time and then maybe do this scene by scene and break it down. Oh, it's just too much. But after that, then I slowly will start to, do second watch, and I'll come up with some broader emotions. Most of my markers in my like logic template, if I'm doing scoring to a scene, are kind of weird looking, and just like, it'll just be like, victory, or it'll be like, something's coming, or or whatever. But it'll just be like whatever musically to me or emotionally I'm hearing. And then once that sort of feels generally locked in and it's not overly cluttered, but it's got enough, that's when I go to scoring. And that's the part that's always different every time. Yes. And not consistent. But the consistent part is the mapping out of the ideas.
That's exact. I've tried to explain that to a couple of my students before. But I have all these processes locked in place, like in terms of like, how do I approach harmony? How do I approach orchestration?
Yeah.
And they're nice.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, if I need to, if I'm really stuck, I have a system in place that I can rely on.
Mm-hmm.
But the composing itself almost never follows an exact process with a film. I mean, I've done things where I've started with a chord progression. I've had things where I just kind of got a guitar out, or I started working with a melody, or I tried improvising. I think the weirdest one I ever did was I got so frustrated that I couldn't come up with an idea that I just watched the scene on repeat and recorded myself just singing randomly.
Oh, yeah.
Screen. And then I wouldn't even listen to it. I just started another track. I recorded singing again. I did it like 5 times. And then I would go through like, all right, that was something. That was something.
Yeah.
Just trying to find something. But it's always different.
Yeah, well, the challenge too is that like you're there's so many barriers from getting what's in your head out. Like, working in a DAW has many, many challenges. I mean, you're talking, if you're doing mock-ups like I tend to do, you're talking about realism. With orchestration stuff, you're talking about your ability to actually like get those ideas out, which, what if you hear some big run in your head? And now the second that you start to go and say, what is that run? Is it this? And you start to play it and it's like, no, that's not it. Is it this? And now over that, as that time is going on, you're actually losing that connectivity to the idea you had in your head. Right. And next thing you know, you're not audiating anymore. You're not getting ideas from your head out. You're just like putzing around, which can be fine, but usually the best music comes from like getting your ideas out. So there is this whole separate skill set, I guess, going to this question of you need to have built-in efficiency, built-in tools into your workflow that enable you to get ideas out quickly, which people on my YouTube know I'm obsessed about that. And like, that means, like you pointed out, having multiple ways of being creative, whether it's like just a voice memo is great because then you can just go, and like, that's going to be a run and you don't have to get caught in the details so early that you lose the big picture,
Right. Yeah, I really like that. That's a good idea. It was like the idea of kind of, because I have been watching your channel for a while and I've always admired like your use of macros.
Yeah, I'm a nerd at that.
I keep telling myself like, I'm going to do this too. I'm going to build all my macros.
Yeah.
I'm going to set them all up. And then I just, for whatever reason, never find the time to do it. I mean,
yeah.
I have the time. I just never get around to it.
Well, you know what it is? It's that you spend, I totally get it. And it's funny because I did that stuff like during quarantine. That's when I was like, I'm going to just like soup up I'm glad I did it that way because now I don't feel like doing it anymore. But the problem is that I was just learning about this actually. People will say, I don't have the time to set up this workflow thing. It's just faster if I do it the slightly longer way, which is true in the short term. But then when you add up all the times that you do it, it's actually way faster in the long term to just set it up. It's just about it's just about that switch in the brain of like, if I do it once, I never have to do it again, you know?
Right. And that is one of the nice things about YouTube is I'm just going to tell myself I need to make a video about this. And I'm going to make a video about something, then it's like, all right.
Then you're forced to do it. Exactly. Yeah, that's how I do. That's how I study orchestration stuff. I'm like, I want to learn this score. Let me just make a video about it, and then I have to. Yeah.
Exactly, right?
Totally get that.
If you tell people that you're going to be doing it. They're like,
100%.
Keep an eye out for this video. It's like, yeah, all right, now I actually have to do it.
Accountability is like one of the biggest ways that I force myself to do things, for sure. Especially with breaks, to be honest with you. Like, actually telling people, like, I'm going on a 2-week break. That's the only way I'll actually stick to my guns to it. You know, otherwise I'm just like, maybe I could make a video.
Right? Like, I could do a video. It's like, I just got an idea. I wonder if I try that out.
Yeah, yeah.
But, yeah.
Oh, I was also going to say, too, with the figuring out what to portray your music, you made a great point as well, which is like not just the efficiency tools, but also having some, as you develop your voice, you'll build tools for different emotions, I think. And that's not necessarily like, I mean, I do kind of like the idea of having like a bank of harmony for various emotions. Like, what does betrayal sound like? Or revenge, or, you know, loneliness. I think that's cool. I don't think it's always like people can always identify what they do in those situations. But I do think that building some tools and like having some familiarity with the language of emotion is great, because people do like tend to, I know composers like will have a sweet spot. Like, oh, I love writing, you know, romantic fantasy stuff with strings. That's cool. That's awesome. But most stories are going to be a lot more dynamic than just your favorite sweet spot. Right. And to do media, especially, you have to be very versatile, not necessarily stylistically, but most definitely emotionally. You have to be able to convey emotions in lots of ways.
And that it's so important. And one of the frustrating things, especially when you're first starting out, is I remember it's so difficult to figure out how to portray emotions.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah.
You're trying to find books, and there's templates here and there, and but the most maddening thing is you look up what makes this piece of music sound so epic or something, and you find a forum on Reddit that has the exact title you're looking for, and it's a bunch of people just screaming about how music has no inherent emotion and such.
Yeah,
it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. It's an awesome debate, but like if I want to keep my job, I got to figure out how to do this emotion.
Yes, it's often gestural. I find that a lot of it is about, you know, as musicians, again, we like get caught in the weeds sometimes. Yes. So we're like, it's this choice of voicing, or it's the fact that this is A4 instead of A2 or something like that. But it's like, it's actually, in my experience, way more gestural. And again, linked to story. I mean, I did an analysis of, did you see The Green Mile?
No, I haven't. It's on my phone.
I don't necessarily want to spoil anything, so I won't for anybody who hasn't seen it. But there's a really powerful scene that involves a death at one point in the story.
I know what you're talking about. YouTube Shorts has ruined this scene for me.
There you go. Okay, sweet.
Spoiled it.
So Newman does this incredible thing, which when I say it, it sounds obvious, but I think it's about that. This is my perspective on what I think he's doing, but this is how I think about music when I'm studying it. He's got piano playing this line, you know, some ostinato, and then as soon as the character passes over, the piano drops out and just strings take over. And that moment always makes me bawl my eyes out, and I'm like, maybe the piano is like a singular instrument. It's like a solo character. And strings, we kind of like are more like the muse or something, like heavenly, like it's an ensemble as opposed to a single instrument. And so it sort of feels like something passing on, because the melody gets passed from a solo piano to the strings. And it's like, that's gestural. It's not like, you know, it's all about that gesture and about inferring what that means for story. And those are the tools that you can take and utilize in powerful ways.
Yes, I can't agree more because this is like I'm starting to stutter a little bit just because I'm trying to get a whole lot of thoughts out. But
It's all good.
this is exactly what I try to talk about because I never graduated, but I studied for a bit with Berkeley, and with film scoring they talk all about like studying characters. If you want to figure out how to do your character theme, study the character. What does this character inform about your music? What does the story world portray about the sounds you should use? It's beautiful, but then when it comes to emotion, they're like, oh yeah, here's the templates. Here's what you do.
Here's sad music template. Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, my background, so like the bit of my story, like I was trained to be a therapist. I was in grad school to be a therapist in a hospital when I finally decided, no, I want to do music.
Oh, okay.
And so I have this huge background of 6 years of my life dedicated to studying kind of therapy and psychometric tools and such. And I remember having a conversation with my roommate. I was like, there's all these tools we have available as therapists because there's so many times where you meet someone who a lot of their issues is they don't know how to understand their own emotions. And that causes all kinds of issues when you don't like, especially when you're working with a little kid and the kid doesn't know how to tell that they're not scared, they're not angry, they're just frustrated. And not being able to tell the difference between them causes them to lash out like they're angry when it's just frustration. So I could go on a whole kind of rabbit trail with this.
No, I'm into that. I mean, I think music's very similar. So,
right?
Yeah.
And there's all these tools available to try and describe and understand emotions.
Yeah.
I thought, well, if we study characters and worlds to create the music, why can't we study the emotions? And there's one in particular, one tool. It's an older tool. And if you try to use this with a therapist, they're like, it's called the circumplex model of effect, or the CMA. And the idea was, in the 80s, this psychologist came up with the idea that you can describe any emotion as a combination of two things, all right? How positive or negative the emotion is on a spectrum, and then how intense or how intensely it's experienced, again, on a spectrum. And I thought, that's perfect for music, because the two things that music is really good at is manipulating how dark or bright it is, and then manipulating how much energy it has.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, because I think that it's to that point too, when we say something sounds like melodramatic, it tends to be because we're over accentuating an emotion that we're perceiving to be actually a bit more subtle. So you're going sad instead of like sad, or that's I think where that's where I think that having music do something different than what's happening on screen is really powerful, because that's when this character can be blowing up, but that like you made a great point, an interesting point about is that explosion like just reactionary? Are they really that angry? What are they actually feeling inside?
Yes.
Do you think that I always wonder this, do you think that really great composers for media need to have a lot of emotional awareness in order to do their job?
That's a really good question.
Because I'm trying to think of things to counter that. I'm trying to think, are there any like really great composers that I'm aware of that seem to be like rocks? And I can't think of any. I feel like they're all
historical figures who might be.
True.
Like Debussy was famous for just there's all kinds of stories about him just being a dick to a bunch of people.
Yeah,
and, like not being. So there's
that confuses me even more. Then I'm like, how is that possible? But I
think a composer needs to have incredible insight into something other than music, because, in my opinion, when you're writing music, like you mentioned earlier, you have your perspective that you're bringing, your unique perspective, and that perspective has to be informed by something else. So Hans Zimmer talks about how he loves studying emotions. Or not emotions, sorry. Yeah, color theory. Don't know why I said emotion. I think it's in context. He loves studying color theory. He reads books on color theory. He watches documentaries on color theory. He says that he likes to break down the movies, taking one frame from each scene to create kind of a strip of color.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Right? Really cool thing. And it's something that you wouldn't really consider, like as being part of it. Dvorak was known for being really big into strength training. He was ahead of his time. The idea of training with dumbbells and the idea of progressive overload, kind of get stronger as you move on. And that can be heard in his music. Like everyone has something that they bring to bring to the table. And I think for a composer, a lot of us are really in tune with our emotions because that's why we want to write music, because we hear something, we experience an emotional thing, like, I want to do that. That was amazing. I want other people to feel something.
Yeah.
And that's what brings us into it. But I think what it takes to be kind of a great composer is you've got to be fanatic about something outside of music. You got to be something fanatic enough that if you're doing music, you're bringing this with you, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Yeah, I think fanatic actually about story, which is probably why I'm in the career that I'm in, because I find myself, whether it's talking about music or not, I drive my wife nuts because we'll be watching a movie or something, and I'll be like, we were just watching The Invisible Man. It was a really good movie, really good. But I was just totally fanboying over the use of camera through the movie, because I'm just like, wow, like it was so brilliant. One of the antagonist is like in an invisible suit, so like you can't see him, but you don't know that in the beginning of the movie. And they would start to do things like they would film a scene of this like family celebrating something, but they'd film it from like just a little too far away, with like a hallway kind of like halfway through the frame. And it's like just starting to plant the seed in your brain that like, is somebody there, And like, I just love that. It has nothing to do with music, but for me, I just, I don't know, there's something I've just always been passionate about, story and how you can enhance story. So I guess to your point, it's probably what drives me to do like storytelling through music. Right. But for everybody, it's different, I suppose. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
like everyone's got to be fanatic about something. But I think you're onto it. I think a lot of us are brought into music because we got a strong emotional response. Yeah, and because we're passionate about storytelling. Because that's the same with me. I love storytelling. I love the craft of storytelling. There's another YouTube channel called I think it's like Hello Future Me, and
I'll write that one down.
Like, I'm a huge D&D nerd. All right, I love writing stories. I love coming up with like situations and worlds, and I would watch his channel all the time because he's all about creating, like how to do world building, how to create effective characters. And this actually kind of ties into another question we got, which was what non-musical works greatly influence your approach to composition. And right, like early on when I was first kind of like, I want to do something music, but I don't know what. I read this amazing book called The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, which is an incredible book that kind of breaks down how do you figure out your characters, how do you create your world, and then let the story grow organically from there. And that, I think, more than anything else, has had a huge impact on my spotting process.
Yeah.
Because my entire approach to composing, whether it's emotions or characters or worlds or whatever, I always try to understand it. So like with an emotion, I'll start with like the basic generic thing I talked about earlier. How dark is it? How bright is it? Get in a general ballpark. But then I want to know more. I want to know like how expected was the thing that triggered this emotion.
Yeah.
So like that always colors it. If you a morbid example I like to use is losing a pet. Like having the pet die after a couple weeks, you were given notice and you have to put them down because of an illness. Versus the dog running out into the street, into oncoming traffic. Those are both very different experiences. One is very sudden, and one is more slow burning and building. And I try to look at that. I try to look at all these different things because the more aspects, the more information I find that I understand about an emotional experience, the more sources of inspiration I have for the music.
Yeah, absolutely. And the challenging part is, I think my biggest wake-up call was doing... I wrote additional music for Kung Fu Panda on Netflix, and it was a blast. I always tell people that was such a fun project, thankfully, because sometimes those larger projects are not fun and people are not nice, but everybody on the team was super nice. But my big wake-up call was realizing just how, I probably wrote maybe an hour and a half of music in total, and so, I would hit some of the same kinds of beats in a scene because it was like, 20-minute episodes. And so as a kid's animation, there's always going to be some similar kind of story arc, you know,
Yeah.
and there's going to be like that moment. I remember particularly, I would always hit, probably scored maybe 5 or 6 times this, like, the downtrodden character, Dark Night of the Soul, where they're just like, everything's going wrong, nothing's going my way, and then they have another character who buddies up and is like, hey, cheer up, you know, yada yada, and they go together. And like, what always blew my mind was, as similar as those beats were, they always required different things. They were always nuanced enough to be different. And, you know, sometimes it would be like, oh, there's this father-son relationship happening here. Or it's like, this character was a really stoic, proud character and finally has admitted their vulnerability. Like, those are different. They're different. They're similar moods, but they're different because of what builds up to it and the context. And that was when I realized, like you're pointing out with your analogy, that even the same outcomes have different things leading to it and require different scoring. And so you're 100% right. Exploring that through art and life and experience outside of music, it's the only way you're going to get the tools to be able to relate to that information. Otherwise, you're just like, you know, minor chord for sad scene, and you're just kind of like getting gridlocked by that.
Right? Now, I am interested. So, kind of the idea of like you create those initial kind of vibes. Like I would say, I've got tools to go for a basic vibe, or if I want to create kind of a sad vibe. Again, minor chords, minor keys, slower tempo, longer notes, stuff like that. But then trying to add that additional context, like you were talking about, trying to make it a little more unique to this scene. I am curious on how you will go about figuring out, like, how do you go about brainstorming the different ideas you can use for that?
I mean, for me, it is a bit of a trial and error process, so it'll just be kind of slapping things on, seeing what works. But I also do... Sometimes I have aha moments. And for me, I think maybe 90% of my learning is like retroactive, where it'll be, why did that work? What did I do? Or why did that not work? And what should I have done? And moving forward from that. So I can think of some examples where, like, I wasn't totally happy with how I scored things. Like, I remember there was one scene that was just like that scene I was talking about, and I did kind of like the generic thing where I did like a solo piano, like, you know, open voicings things. Mm-hmm. And it was just like, it was okay. You know, it worked. It did the job. It didn't like wow me or like stimulate my brain. There was a different moment where I led the intro of the cue with a solo horn for a character that I was talking about that's normally like a very proud character that kind of like admitted vulnerability. Just intuitively, mostly, just led it with a horn. But I realized, like, you know, a couple things I realized off of that was, like, you know, not having the piece start off with clear harmony was helpful, because it sort of allows the music to steer in different directions. It doesn't kind of lay on you like it's sad time or it's whatever time, you know? It's more ambiguous. And so I would also start to, like, you know, retroactively be like, okay, note for future self. And when I do similar scenes like that, I'll tend to be a bit less, you know, obtuse about the harmony. Less, you know, don't lay it on so thick, essentially. I can think of another example, too. One of my favorite ones that I did, which for me was a big revelation, was there was a scene... It is out now. I was thinking, like, can I talk about this? But yeah, it's out now. There's a scene when Poe's dad is, like, possessed, essentially, and is attacking Poe. And it's, like, leading to this moment, and everybody's telling Poe the only way he can win this is if he fights back. And he's not fighting back. And it finally, like, culminates to this thing where it looks like he's going to have to fight back, and he, like, it just sort of, like... He says to his dad, like, I'm not going to fight you. I know you're still in there. And he's, like, kind of backing up and stuff. Very Star Wars-ish. And I remember I was like, what do I do for this? And I realized that, like, that was his victory. He already won in that moment. Like, that was his triumph, essentially. And so instead of making it feel dramatic and sad like it had leading up to it, I made it, like, victorious. Kind of like this is the most noble thing he could have done. And like I tried to make the music represent that. And like I always know when something's working because it gives me chills. So when I did it, I got chills and I was like, oh, I got it. I figured something out, you know?
Oh, I love it when that happens. Like,
yeah, it's really it's not often that I get like those super lined up moments, but that was one of them, and it clicked as a lesson for me, like we talked about in the beginning, that it's like you have to think a little deeper than what's on the surface of the picture to really make a powerful impact. And most great film scores, you know, we all love those soundtracks outside of the films. We listen to How to Train Your Dragon stuff, but you're missing out on a huge aspect of the storytelling because you don't know why Powell did the things he did. So you have to see it to picture to understand the intent behind the music.
Yes. It's a composite art form. All right, the music is beautiful. I love listening to it on my phone, but it never, like listening onto Spotify never beats out the experience of watching the movie again. Because then you see it the way it was written. It was written to be watched, not just listened to.
Yes, and I think that's really a great way to study film composing is, you know, to pay attention not just to the music. Like I said, we're all music nerds, so we're all going to be like, oh, I don't, you know, want to write music like that. But more important to be like, when does Powell lay out? How does he get into his scene? How does he like have his music so thematic constantly without ever losing synchronicity with the picture? You know, like those are higher level questions that will generate really good media composers if you can think like that.
If you can get beyond just the simple kind of composition aspect.
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh, I like Celtic flute. Like, yes, that is very cool, and I like that too.
Awesome.
But to score to picture, there's that whole extra aspect, and that's what makes media scoring so hard. Is there's many jobs you're balancing.
Exactly. You've got to work with everybody. You got to make sure that, like you said, you kind of create that perfect synchronicity.
Yeah, 100%.
But this was awesome, Zach. I really appreciate talking about the channel.
Absolutely, yeah. I hope I answered your questions.
I had a lot of fun. All right,
cool.
To anyone who submitted a question and we didn't answer them, let me know in the comments. I would be happy to address them there. So where can people find you, Zach? Anything you want to plug?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would check out my YouTube. I make it my life's work to just try and give as many resources as I can to other composers, share my passion for music. I also have my website, which has some products like my orchestral template. It's got a harp VST that I made with a friend of mine, a couple other things. And then I also have some courses that are coming on the way. So it probably won't be out by then, but just keep an eye out.
Oh, yeah. I'll be keeping an eye out for those.
Yeah.
But thanks, man. I really appreciate this. It was a lot.
Yeah, of course, Steven.
I hope you enjoyed the video. I want to take a quick moment to thank my wonderful patrons who make videos like this one possible. This week, a special shout out goes to my newest patron, Richard Fox. I appreciate your support, my friend. If you're interested in seeing the entire unedited conversation between me and Zach, you can find it over on my Patreon page. So until next time, my friends, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music. I'll see you in the next video.